Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review. Scott Walker, Bish Bosch. It's hardly the time or place for that. Scott Walker is a singer-songwriter who's easily had one of the most interesting trajectories in modern music. The man has thrived in numerous musical decades, sometimes not so successfully or artfully, but still thrived all the same. In the late 50s, Scott Walker's younger self sang upon a lot of teen pop and surf rock singles. But in the mid to late 60s, he really made a name for himself in the world of lavishly produced Baroque pop with a lot of solo singles, some album releases with his trio, the Walker Brothers, as well as 4 cult classic full-length albums, Scott 1 through 4. And these 4 LPs of Scott's are pretty impressive achievements in terms of Baroque pop. Instrumentally, they are very explosive and emotive and also refined. The production stayed crisp and clean and awesome thanks to Scott sticking with John Franz as a producer, and the arrangements stayed very consistent and ambitious thanks to guest arrangers like Wally Stott, Peter Knight, and Reg Guest. Of course, Scott's singing also made these albums great. His baritone voice really had a lot of power and personality behind it, and Scott had a hand in picking some great songs to sing on these LPs as well. Across these 4 full-length albums, Scott covered an album's worth of Jacques Brel songs. But after the release of Scott 4 came the 70s, and the musical landscape was shifting. This was not a particularly pretty time for Walker. This decade brought on an extremely commercial set of soft pop, adult contemporary, and country pop albums. His lack of success in the music industry around this time actually even forced him to get back together with the Walker Brothers, who were kind of on hiatus since 1968, but they eventually broke up finally in 1978. However, before the trio broke up, they actually released a somewhat experimental album titled Night Flights, which was actually surprisingly out there for the Walker Brothers, embracing elements of new wave as well as art pop. The track from the album Shout Out is very fast and danceable with some fiery guitar playing. The beat on that track and just the speed of it reminds me so much of something the Talking Heads would do on an album like Fear of Music. And another track off of this LP, The Electrician, is just like, in a lot of ways, the Baroque pop that the Walker Brothers used to toy with, but so much more twisted and shadowy, with Scott Walker's vocals actually sounding kind of insane over this very heavy and orchestral instrumentation. Scott Walker was still active musically, but his output dissipated a little bit. His next big full-length solo album was Climate of Hunter. That came out in 1984, and it was kind of an art pop LP weakened by a bit of 80s chic. However, this LP still marked a moment of artistic freedom for Walker and was an essential stepping stone to the much more experimental stuff he would be putting out in the future. Which brings me to Walker's 1995 album, Tilt. At this point, this is when Walker started releasing big full-length solo albums in like decade-long spurts. He had other projects like some soundtracks that he had worked on, but these solo albums, this album Tilt is a uniquely dark LP. On this album, Scott's baritone vocal is noticeably aged, but still emotionally powerful, and on this track, Scott sings over an array of different sounds that would probably be a surprise to fans of Scott's Baroque pop stuff. Scott sings over some really dark, moody string arrangements, some noisy and dissonant art rock passages, as well as some drones and dark ambient soundscapes. Scott went even deeper down this rabbit hole in 2006 with the LP The Drift, where he experiments with a bit more noise, a bit more repetition, like on tracks such as Q, and the vocals sound even more aged, kind of actually strained in a sense, but purposely, so that Scott would sound like he's a ghost haunting his own music. Scott's past 2 full-length solo LPs have really put him on a path to Strangeness. And this new album, Bish Bosch, it's the first time in decades he has put out an album within this 10-year gap that has been separating a lot of his LPs. And, you know, just let me say right off the bat to kind of intro talking about this album, it is, bottom line, straightforward, strange. It's f***ed up. So much so that I was actually kind of left standing in awe of its senseless confusion for much of its hour-long length. Let me say before I continue, it seems that no matter how disjointed or senseless an album seems, someone will always come out of the woodwork to say, it means something. Oh, it means A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It means all these things. Here are all these deeper, meaning-filled meanings. But seriously, no joke, I'm telling you, Lou Reed is a more coherent lyricist on Lulu. After listening to this LP, I actually wanted to kind of sit back, relax, and have a nice chilled out listen to Trout Mask Replica. This is unsettling, kind of shock value, let's try all these things kind of music for people who want to just kind of watch the world burn. And Walker certainly sets the world ablaze and dances all on top of the ashes when it's done burning out, and he rubs them all over himself sexily as he prances about. This LP is filled with a lot of very profane and odd lyrics about genitals and blowing up bullfrogs with straws, protein eyes falling out of their eye sockets and dangling on the face. Again, there's just a lot of shock value to these tracks. Yeah, it's not always gory. Yeah, it's not always completely incoherent. For sure, all the songs on this LP are uniformly dismal. It's kind of easy to see that there are some common threads that bring all these tracks together on Bish Bosch. But this is clearly an LP that triumphs through difficulty and inaccessibility. I think when this album actually gets great and interesting is when it creates some weird hybrids and clashes and mishmashes of different musical sounds and styles that you wouldn't really find together. And yet, despite throwing all these flavors in together at once, it all ends up sounding pretty dark and actually nasty. Even though Scott Walker may throw a Latin rhythm into a track with no warning whatsoever, it doesn't necessarily change the whole mood of the thing. It still stays because on this LP you have Scott Walker's aged croon, some heavy, distorted metal guitar riffing, heavy strings, drums that I think may sometimes be acoustic and played live, but a lot of times electric sequenced. Some sharp organ, along with the sound of knives sharpening, dogs barking, Christmas bells jingle jangling, some airy drones as well, acoustic guitar, ukulele. However, I wouldn't just call this album pure randomness. It's not just insane, unpredictable masturbating. There are a lot of spots that actually do come off as pretty intense and meticulously crafted, like the rock drum groove and the dissonant guitar and the really quick, speedy bass line on the track Phrasing toward the end, along with the mantra, "Here's to a lousy life," and the heavy, blood-curdling strings during the first movement of the track ZERCON, a flagpole sitter, which is the album's longest track, standing at 21 minutes. The moment in the track at 6:45 where Scott Walker is like screaming at the top of his lungs with this weird chorus effect on his voice, "What would you do to your own mother?" It's really just, chilling. It does something in here to me that makes everything shake and feel really weird. It's a climax, I guess you could say. From reeking gonads to A Shrunken Face to Greeks f***ing bears to Roman numerals to greasing poles, this track is just one weird thrill after another. Something I'm not sure I would admit I like publicly if I were not doing a review. And even if I would admit it, it would certainly be alone time listening. Another track that stands out to me is the song The track has these weird sequence drums along with some drones that kind of get repeated and switched out with this weird MIDI horn synth phrase. It switches back and forth. You see things kind of repeating throughout the track, and it brings the song some congruency, though still it is pretty strange. And the spot toward the end of the track where Scott Walker is singing "Take That Accidentally in the Bullocks." It was just hilarious. And the thing is, should it be hilarious? I don't know. There's truly no handbook for enjoying an album like this. It kind of is what you make of it. Either you have the wherewithal to stand it and the sick curiosity to keep you kind of enthralled with it, or you don't. If I do have a complaint about this LP, there were songs on this album that I felt didn't really come off as that chilling or that shocking or perplexing. They either did not overwhelm or have much of an element of surprise when I first heard them, or they kind of lost that as I listened to this album more and more and more. Like the track Dimple, which is atmospheric but kind of uneventful. Or the opening track on here, which does have some twisted sounds on it but is a little too repetitive for 4 minutes. And the track Pilgrim, which does have some weird lines on it and some strange percussive loops, but it's a little too short and underdeveloped to really kind of catch my ears in the midst of all these kind of heavy and strange giants looming around it. To put it simply, I would say that this album is not something that you would traditionally enjoy. And if you don't like it, I don't blame you, because it's not a very appealing album, and purposely so. However, I didn't really find it to be that unappealing. I guess you could say when it comes to freak shows, it's not the freakiest of them all, because there were a good handful of tracks on this album where I kind of laid sort of unaffected by what was going on the song. And overall, while this LP is pretty well recorded and there were some musical moments, especially the rushes of strings in the second track that I thought were pretty awesome, I feel like I'm basing my enjoyment of this album mostly on just simply its weirdness, which I think can be kind of a double-edged sword depending on how much of it you use when you go into making a piece of music. I'm feeling a light to decent 7 on this LP. If you've given it a listen, what did you think of it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Why? And what do you think I should review next? Anthony Fantano, Bish Bosch, forever.